the non-belief is incoherent omnibus. Number 3. The argument from the excluded middle. Premise 1. Based on the principle of the excluded middle, there are two options, P or not P. The law of the excluded middle can be expressed by the propositional formula P or not P. It means that a statement is either true or false. Think of it as claiming that there is no middle ground between being true and being false. Every statement has to be one or the other. That's why it's called the law of the excluded middle, because it excludes a middle ground between truth and falsity. Premise 2. In the case of dichotomous propositions, the degrees of credence granted between a proposition and its negation are inversely proportional. The less likely one finds a proposition, the more likely one finds the negation of that proposition. This is known as principle of duality or principle of inverse probabilities. Premise 3. The existence of a third option, apart from believing a claim is true and believing a claim is false, has not been substantiated. The existence of a distinct state of non-belief is the point of contention. Conclusion. Therefore, there is no middle ground between not believing P and believing not P. If proposition P is subject believes proposition X is true, then the negation of this proposition, not P, is both subject does not believe proposition X and subject believes proposition X is not true. This is because a tertiary position of non-belief has not been substantiated. Indeed, this is the point of contention. Therefore, to argue otherwise results in circular reasoning. It is for this reason that any assertion that saying one believes either a claim or its negation is not a false dichotomy. One cannot logically appeal to a third possibility until such a possibility has been substantiated. A good illustration of this would be the question of an even or odd number of stars versus the result of a coin toss. The former is a true dichotomy. However, the latter has a third possibility of the coin landing on its edge, unlikely as that outcome may be. Therefore, I don't believe that the result will be heads or tails has some justification. I don't believe there is an even or an odd number of stars does not, because no other option has been substantiated in reality. It is just asserted.
The argument under examination attempts to establish a strict dichotomy between belief and disbelief while invoking the law of excluded middle. However, a closer analysis reveals significant conceptual and logical issues in its premises. The author conflates distinct epistemic and doxastic categories, misinterprets probabilistic reasoning, and fails to substantiate key claims. This critique will address these problems, showing that the argument is both inconsistent and unpersuasive. Let's look at the first premise. Based on the principle of the excluded middle, there are two options, P or not P. Surprisingly, the author shows enough respect to Bubonic to accurately quote his work. But the formulation that the author presents is pretty non-standard and could be clarified. It is enough to say this: for every proposition, either this proposition or its negation is true. You can certainly formulate as, for every P, P or not P. This is perfectly acceptable in most cases. It tracks our understanding of the truth values of propositions. Every statement is either true or false. But there are some considerations with regard to proposition P. And the law of excluded middle has a different interaction with doxastic attitudes. For now, consider proposition P as, the present King of France is bald. Since the law of excluded middle tells us that every statement is either true or false, the sentence "the present King of France is bald" must either be true or false. Since there is no present King of France, it would be weird to claim that this sentence is true. But if we accept the law of excluded middle, this leaves us to consider the claim false, which is just as weird. In either case, the proposition is about a non-existent entity and thus doesn't have a truth value. At this point, we could consider rejecting the law of excluded middle altogether, or just that it doesn't hold in all cases. Bertrand Russell, British philosopher, logician, mathematician, and public intellectual, presents his own solution to this problem. In his 1905 paper on denoting, Russell describes his theory of definite descriptions. Consider what "the present King of France is bald" is actually saying and what it implies. That, there is a present King of France and he is bald. So the fact that there is no present King of France implies that the sentence is false, and we have the solution we need. Understand that Russell's solution suggests that we can't just extract the logical structure of a sentence from its grammatical structure, we must take other things into account. Stop and think before believing nonsense. And respect the significance of proposition P. Premise 2 states, in the case of dichotomous propositions, the degrees of credence granted to a proposition and its negation are inversely proportional. The author cites Bayes and Jeffreys, but neither of these sources establish a general principle of duality. But let's talk about credences. Credence can be described as a related but separate propositional attitude from belief and disbelief that represents an agent's degree of confidence in a proposition on a continuous scale. Since credence does not require full commitment to P or not P, it does not affirm in either direction. Which seems to ignore the law of excluded middle as described in the first premise. Premise 1 insists on a strict dichotomy, either P or not P is true, while premise 2 doesn't. Credence doesn't assert the truth of falsity of P in a categorical manner, and it does not follow the law of excluded middle. This is a logical inconsistency between the two premises. Now, the principle of inverse probabilities does come from Bayesian probability and refers to how we update our degree of belief in a hypothesis given new evidence. In simple terms, it states that the probability of a hypothesis H given evidence E is proportional to the probability of the evidence given the hypothesis, weighted by the prior probability of the hypothesis. Mathematically, this is Bayes' theorem. It would be a mistake to conclude that a degree of belief in Bayesian probability maps cleanly onto a degree of credence in Bayesian epistemology. A degree of belief is an objective measure calculated from Bayes' theorem, while a degree of credence is a subjective measure of confidence. In Bayesian terms, P, A, plus P, not A, equals 1. That is the probability of A plus the probability of not A equals 1. This applies to probability measures, but does not translate to doxastic attitudes such as belief and disbelief or credence. There is no reason to assume that credence is P is directly inverse to credence in not P. There are some limitations in that total credence must be less than or equal to 1, but that doesn't force an inverse relationship. For example, a person could have C, P, equals 0.2, low credence in P, and C, not P, equals 0.3, low credence in not P, simultaneously. Now, it is possible for someone to use a degree of belief to justify a particular degree of credence, but this isn't strictly necessary in all cases. It is enough to say that the author has conflated probabilities, which are subject to an inverse relationship between, and credences, which strictly aren't even if they are limited in combined range in a similar manner. Premise 3. There are in fact two other options: disbelieving a claim is true and disbelieving a claim is false. Belief and disbelief are two different doxastic attitudes one can have towards a proposition. Even if I accept a binary belief structure, the premise is still false. As a side note, I have no reason to accept this premise unless the author provides a proper argument for it. By stating this as an unquestioned premise, the author assumes what they are supposed to prove. It seems to beg the question. To say that the existence of a third option has not been substantiated is to say there is no middle ground. And to say there is no middle ground is to say there is no third option. The author is essentially claiming that there hasn't been enough evidence or reasoning to support non-belief as a distinct doxastic attitude and epistemic stance. This is false because there are well-established philosophical discussions and arguments about the validity of non-belief, a neutral stance in relation to propositions. The author's claim here disregards this body of work, making it an unsupported and inaccurate statement. If the author demands empirical demonstration of the abstract concept of non-belief, I would simply ask, where is the number 2? Much like the number 2 or even the idea of truth, non-belief is an abstract concept and can be justified through philosophical argument. If the author insists, then it just seems like they're being selectively skeptical. Conclusion: therefore, there is no middle ground between not believing P and believing not P. I don't see how this is true. If P is the proposition and not P its negation, then one may affirm one or the other but not both. If belief is taken as synonymous with affirmation, then there is no contradiction in not affirming P while affirming not P. The contradiction would only arise if one affirmed both P and not P simultaneously. As it stands, these are two different propositional attitudes applied to two different propositions. One could argue that there is no middle ground when applying two contradictory propositional attitudes to the same proposition, but that wouldn't be an application of the law of excluded middle, that would just be a plain contradiction. The author's example contains faulty logic. If the proposition is, the subject believes proposition X is true, then its negation is the subject does not believe proposition X is true. To negate the proposition, we apply the negation to the attitude, not to the belief content itself. Otherwise, we would be changing the belief rather than negating the original statement, meaning we would no longer be talking about the same thing. Proposition X is the object of belief, what's being considered. Proposition X is true asserts the truth of the proposition. Proposition X is not true asserts the falsehood of the proposition. Each of these has different belief content because they operate at different levels of assertion. The first concerns the world directly, while the latter two concern the truth status of that assertion. The author conflates these distinctions, leading to a flawed conclusion. Going back to the conclusion itself. The argument claims that there is no middle ground between not believing P and believing not P, but this is mistaken. The author misapplies the law of excluded middle to doxastic attitudes, conflates belief with probability, and ignores the well-established category of non-belief. Not believing P does not entail believing not P, as these are distinct attitudes toward different propositions. The author also falsely assumes that credences must be inversely proportional, which misrepresents Bayesian reasoning. Lastly, by dismissing non-belief without justification, the argument begs the question rather than proving its point. Ultimately, the argument constructs a false dichotomy and collapses under scrutiny.